Since this is more of an advanced Perfect Effects webinar, I'm not going to be going over a lot of the basics today. If you need help with the basics, take a look at one of those archived webinars. It's called Getting Started with Perfect Effects 8, and that's a really good place to learn some of the simple functions of how Perfect Effects 8 works. What I want to focus on today are some of the functions that we don't necessarily talk about quite as much or don't introduce in some of those beginning webinars. Things like advanced blending options, using combining and editing presets, and using specific filters and presets for certain types of images. There are lots of different things that we have access to here that I think a lot of people glaze over just because they don't even know that they're there. So that's where I want to start out today. Now, the first thing we're going to go over are blending modes. We're going to be using this image here, which is a silhouette, and it works perfectly for kind of understanding how blending modes work and understanding how different components work with your image. I'm going to go ahead. I'm working in Lightroom today as my base program. Everything that we do inside Perfect Effects today, you can do in any other application that you like to use. So I'm going through Lightroom. If you go through Photoshop Elements, Aperture, if you use the program as a standalone, if you have Perfect Effects 8 Premium and you don't have the rest of the suite, everything that we do today can be done in any version of Perfect Effects 8 Premium. So you don't have to worry about the fact that you don't have the entire suite. You only have Perfect Effects. It's all the same information today. Okay, we are going to Control click, jump over to Perfect Effects 8. Now, one of the great things about using Perfect Effects, and one of the things that I love the most about the program, is the versatility of it, and is the ability to take an image that needs a little bit more oomph, needs a little bit more juice, and really make it stand out, really make it pop. What the blending modes do, give you a way to selectively edit your image without having to go in and do things, for instance, like masking. I don't want to have to spend a lot of time masking this image. It's pretty much split in half. Half of it is black and the other half is not necessarily white, but it's pretty bright. The masking that I would have to do for this image necessarily wouldn't take the longest time, but we have grading here down towards the bottom. So if I wanted to separate my shadows or my silhouette from the background of my image, it would end up taking a lot more time that I don't necessarily want to spend. And so blending modes can be a way to cut down on that. They can also be a great way to take an absolutely wonderful filter and enhance it even more. Now, one of the best ways to see how blending modes works is by using a pretty flat, pretty basic color styling. So I'm going to choose one of the vintage filter presets here, and it'll be used as a base for what we're going to be talking about today. Now, this one is called Earth, and it's a blue to brown split tone on the image. It's actually really cool. In the filter options pane, I'm going to take the amount slider and move it all the way over to 100 so you can really see that color overlay that's happening on the photo. It just makes the entire process a little bit more obvious. Now, to access your blending options, jump up to the filter stack. It's right at the bottom and it's not opened up, so you have to click on the blending options to open up all of them. And we can see all of the different things that we have access to. Now, the first drop-down menu is the actual blending mode. This is how this vintage filter is blending in to my original image. And if you've ever used Photoshop or Photoshop Elements, you're going to recognize this list of blending modes. And I'm not going to go through every single one because there are tons in there and they all have lots of different explanations. But I will go through and kind of give you some of the highlights. Right up at the top, we have Darken. What Darken does is it takes all of the pixels, all of the color pixels, from the filter that we created, so that split tone Earth vintage filter. It takes all of the darker pixels and it places them over the lighter pixels in the underlying image. So you'll see the shadow remains intact because it was much darker than the colors that were created by that vintage filter. However, the highlights were so bright, So the vintage filter placed that darker blue over the highlights to darken them. And that's the way Darken works. The opposite is something called Lighten. It swaps everything around. It keeps the lighter pixels from your original image so that it remains nice and bright. And then it lightens up all of the darker pixels using whatever filter you've added. Now, we also have things called Multiply, which basically blends and darkens the entire filter into your image. And then the opposite is Screen. It blends and lightens into your image. Two of the most popular are Overlay and Soft Light, which create this kind of high contrast look. These don't necessarily work best when you're using things like color filters on your image, but you can kind of see how much of a higher contrast, higher saturation this image has than it did before. And then a couple of the others that are also really good to note are down at the bottom. It's Color and Luminosity. Color is the one that I use the most. One of the things that you'll notice is it's taken all of the colors from that vintage filter and it's applied them to the image, but it's left my entire tonal range completely alone. So all of those dark blacks and all of the very dark shadows that surround it are still nice and deep and dark. However, they have this kind of soft brownish hue over them. All of the highlights are still really bright, except that now they have this kind of bluish, purplish hue over them. I don't have to worry about affecting any of my tones, it's only affecting the color. Luminosity is the opposite. It keeps the color information the exact way that it is, but it takes whatever filter you used and affects just the tonal range. So these two are really, really important, especially when you're using things like textures and you want to adjust how that texture is working with your image, or if you're using specialized color effects. If you really love this filter, but you don't like what it's doing to the tonal range, it's completely flattening out your entire image, you can choose this color blending mode. You get the cool brown and the blue without having to affect your silhouette. So understanding and working and playing around with blending modes is really important to the base of using a program like Perfect Effects. Now I'm going to jump back up to normal there. Underneath, we also have something called the Apply To drop-down menu. This gives you the ability to selectively apply this filter to just a certain area of your image. So we have things like the highlights, which is pretty much most of the background, the midtones, which is a very small amount kind of speckled across the center of the image, and then the shadows. So now I just have this actually really kind of cool brownish hue over the shadows, and everything else is being untouched. I can separate everything down into specific color channels. I even have the options of doing things like neutrals, vivid colors, flesh colors, which usually kind of is, it seems to cover pretty much anything, but it does it in this like slightly softer way. And then individual like specific color channels. Now, you can also go in and use the Eyedropper tool and select a specific color. So you just click on anywhere in your image that you want this to affect, and it will go in and it will add that filter to that specific color sample. Now, one of the things that you might be seeing is this kind of weird pixelated dissolving effect, which is really strange. You can help fix that by using the range slider right next to it. This affects the range of the color that you've just selected. So if I move that slider all the way over to the right, it's going to add more information to that selection. So if we go in and we choose somewhere like the sky, and I drop this range slider down, it's going to remove more and more of that filter until it's just in that small strip of sky. So play around with this range slider because it can completely change what section of the image is being affected. And then the last category is your protect section. The protect sliders protect certain tones in your image. So we have highlights. We can protect the background a little bit. I actually really like that effect. It's pretty cool. We can protect the shadows. It's going to go in and protect all of those deep silhouettes, as well as the skin tones. The skin tone slider works great on portraits. For this image, it's not going to work quite as well. It's going to cover some of the yellows and reds and oranges in the image. So it's taking a look at all of those different buildings in the background, which obviously are not skin tones, but you can see the effect that it's creating. It's helping trying to remove that color tone from any of those warmer sections. Now, once we're done and we've gone in and we've adjusted this, so I'm going to change the Apply to drop-down menu to Shadows, and I'm going to leave my blending mode the way that it is. I'm going to go up to the top of my filter stack and adjust the layer opacity. The layer opacity is something that I use pretty often, and it's very, very useful because if you scroll down to your filter options pane, one of the things that you'll notice is that you have lots of different sliders down here. We have the amount, the saturation, and the film grain sections. Now I could go down and I could remove just part of this filter until I'm happy, and that's a great way of doing it. However, what the layer opacity does is it affects all of the different sliders and all of the different options that you have in a single filter options pane. And that's one of the reasons why I like to use it. I don't have to worry about trying to screw around with any of the other sliders, trying to figure out how much saturation I want to remove, how much amount I want to remove, how much film grain. It goes through and it just reduces the opacity of the entire layer. And I use this pretty often. So I can drop this down, and now I've got this kind of like faded brownish shadow look. And this is something that I use pretty regularly. The faded look is really in right now. You'll see lots of different engagement photos, wedding photos with that faded shadow look. And I really like to give that fade a bit of a color tone. So I like to give it a warmer brown. And I use this all the time. This is not a pre-packaged anything. This vintage preset that we used is completely different straight out of the box than what we just did to it. And that's one of the reasons why blending options is such an amazing tool and why it should be used so often is because we took a filter that was completely different at the beginning and we adjusted it to make it work for our image. And I think that that's pretty cool. So now up in the filter stack, right down on the bottom left-hand corner, I'm going to close that blending options and click the plus button. We're going to add another empty layer, and I'm going to go down to my filter options drop-down menu and open up the Texturizer. The Texturizer has a very similar blending mode drop-down menu, but we call it something called mode. And this is just the, obviously, blending mode that we want to put this texture in. The only thing about this is it's a very, very small list. There are only 4, and these are pretty much the 4 most popular blending modes that you can add. There's normal, which is the equivalent of overlay. It creates a high contrast look. Subtle, which is the slightly more subtle version of normal. And then there's lighter and darker. And both of these are pretty much the same as the Lighten and Darken blending modes that we saw earlier. These are the 4 most typical that are used when you're working with textures. So we put them all here so that you don't have to worry about adjusting blending options in a slightly different place. And I think that it's really helpful. So for this image, I would use the subtle option, and I could go through and I could play around with things like the opacity of the texture, the color of the texture, if it's got kind of a strange hue to it. I can adjust the saturation if I want to desaturate the texture. I can lighten or darken it if I want to. And I can even adjust the scale. The Texturizer is an absolutely amazing tool here. And one of the things that I really love about it is the fact that I don't have to worry about blending options that much. Now, what is really cool is if I need to, I can still adjust this Texturizer just the way that we did with the vintage layer. So for this image, if I want to remove the texture from the shadows, I can jump up to my blending options and use that shadow slider, and we can help protect some of those darker tones. And now we still have that cool concrete look on the background, but it's much softer and much more subtle on the silhouette in the foreground. I didn't push the shadows slider all the way over to the right, so I still get a bit of a faint texture, so it doesn't look really kind of chopped up. Still looks a little bit more, I guess, realistic. It flows a little bit better. There we go. So it flows a little bit better, but it's a little bit softer. So Each one of these different filters can be adjusted, and each one of them will have a different blending option, will have a different layer opacity, will have a different adjustment in your filter options pane. And to know that everything is customizable, that's one of the reasons why Effects is such a cool program, is that it's continually customizable. Now, the last thing that I want to do with this image is add a vignette. So I want to finish this off with a vignette. We added an empty layer, and then I'm going to scroll down to my filter options and just open up the vignette category. Now, one of the things that you might be noticing is that pretty much, I think about 100% of the time, I use the filter options pane. I know exactly what filter I'm looking for. I don't need to worry about trying to find the filter that's going to work best for the image. Now, part of this is because I obviously work for Unwin Software, so I do this for a living. I sit and I use Perfect Effects. I teach you guys how to use Perfect Effects. I teach everybody else how to use it, and I love it. So I get to use this program day in, day out, and that's one of the plus sides of my job. So I know where everything is. If you know the filters that you're looking for and you know what you want, you don't need to work with the Filters tab on the left-hand side if you don't want to. I go straight over to my filter options and I use the base filter that I'm looking for. Now, what's great about that is down, usually right in the middle of the filter options pane, you'll see a preset drop-down menu. These are most of the presets that you're going to find on the left-hand side. Not all of them. There are actually more in the filter options preset drop-down menu than you'll find in some of these categories. Now, for the most part, they're about the same, but every once in a while, there might be an extra preset in this drop-down menu that you don't see. But I can go through and I can hover my mouse over each one of these until I find one that's going to work. And it's very similar to the way that we're looking at the previews in the Filters tab on the left-hand side. So it's completely up to you what's more comfortable for your workflow. If you know what you're looking for, jump right in. If you need more of a visual entrance into an idea of what you want, then go over to the left-hand side. Now I'm going to go up and select the Big Softy, which is one that I use pretty regularly. I'm going to play around with all of my different sliders for this vignette. So we have things like brightness. We don't want it quite so dark. The size, so how close we want it to the edge. The feathering amount, this is a huge soft vignette. I'm just going to drop that down a tad. And then roundness. Roundness is one of the most important. And I always end up showing this off because I think a lot of times people don't realize what roundness actually does, but it changes the shape, the actual shape of your vignette. So I dropped down the brightness and the size so that you guys can really see it here. But when you pull roundness down to -100, it gives you a rectangular or square vignette. If I start to move it over to the right, you get rounded corners slowly until you get a perfect oval. Right at 0, you're going to get a perfect oval. Then as you continue to move it over to the right, it slowly flattens out, and eventually, up at 100, you're going to reach a perfect circle. What I like to do, and this is personal, but I find it really, really helpful, is I like to size out my vignette with a feathering of 0%. I like to see where this vignette is actually going to be before I feather it out. So I know that I want the corners to be burned in. I don't want a lot of the edges. I really just want the corners. So I'm going to drop that roundness down. I want my size to be pretty close to the edge, and I want my brightness to be a little bit up. Now that I have it pretty well positioned, then I'll go in and adjust the feathering amount. And it creates the effect that I was looking for. So I find that really helpful when I'm working with vignettes because I can visually see what I want. And then as I move that feather slider over, it creates the vignette that I wanted. Now, before we exit the program, I need to save this as a preset. And I'm going to hammer this idea into you repeatedly over and over and over again. Save everything as a preset all the time, every single thing. Save it as a preset. If you don't think you're going to use it again, save it as a preset. If you might use it once, save it as a preset. If you only created one filter in your filter stack, but you made adjustments to the filter options pane, save it as a preset. I cannot say it enough. It is the best way to work inside Perfect Effects. I'm going to jump up to my preset menu and choose Save Preset. We're going to go ahead and type in a preset name. I'm usually really boring and straightforward with this, so I would probably call this something like Warm Shadow Textured Vignette Preset, because that's how I roll. You can get a little bit more creative, so we could just call this, it is kind of like a brownish sepia tone, so I would call this Sepia Concrete Preset. It's not even really that creative. It's just a little bit more explanatory of what it actually is. So that's what I suggest is I can be a little slow sometimes, and I need to be able to actually see what I need. I need to be able to read what I need instead of trying to guess. So the preset name helps me remember that. Now, the other thing that I suggest is that you have lots of different preset categories. I have on my personal computer, this is one that I use for webinars, but on my personal computer, I think I checked the other day, I have over 10 different categories, and I have over 125 presets. And I use them all the time. They are my favorite way to work inside the suite, and they are constantly surprising me with what presets will work with what types of images. And very often I go into the portrait category. I have a whole set of portrait presets that I use for personal images, and I use them constantly on other types of photos, but I know exactly where to find them because they're in a special category. So for this one, I would probably call this Liz's Creative Presets, because this is not really specific to a type of image. It's just very unique in the way that it looks. So I'll go ahead and click OK, type in a creator and a description if I want, and then we'll go ahead and click Create. Now, in the presets library, any of these different categories are going to have lots and lots and lots of presets. However, you can combine multiple presets together. And that's what I want to show you right now. The way that we've kind of tweaked presets to work using Perfect Effects 8 is slightly different. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to open up a category that's really obvious. It's the PE4 Vintage Preset category. These are all of the vintage presets from Perfect Effects 4, our last iteration of Perfect Effects, and you can still use them here. So if you had a couple of favorites, you can play around with them. One of my favorites is this one called Brandon. I use it all the time. There are quite a few others in here that are a lot of fun. Now, I want you to take a look at the filter stack on the right-hand side of the screen. We have our vintage layer, our texturizer, and our vignette. We just went through and created this. When I click on a preset, so I'm going to click on the Insta-Lomo because it's really obvious, it's bright green. Take a look at the right-hand side now in the filter stack. It completely replaced every single filter in that stack. It erased all of them and replaced them with the Insta-Lomo preset. And this will go the same for any preset that you click on. So we could try Honky Tonk. We could try Katie. One of my other favorites is this one called Mayor. And it's going through and it's replacing the entire filter stack. Now this can work great if you want to run through and play around with which presets are going to work best for you. So you can find one that you're going to like. Maybe Nicely Toasted is going to work a little bit better for this one. However, what can be really frustrating is the fact that you may have just accidentally lost some work. If you click a preset and you realize you don't like it, one of the coolest things that you can do is press Control or Command Z. It actually undoes the preset change that you just created. So I can press Control or Command Z quite a few times, and now, even though I clicked on about 5 other presets, I can go back to my original image. So just in case that happens to you, if you make an accident and you click on something you don't like, you can always undo. That's not just for the brush tools, it's also for changes like accidentally clicking the wrong preset or accidentally deleting a filter that you didn't mean to. So the undo button covers a lot of bounds, a lot of things. Now, I'm going to jump back and we're going to click on this Nicely Toasted here. Now let's say that we want to combine this preset with another one. we have Nicely Toasted, and right up above we have one called Nero. And Nero is one of the ones that I used to use all the time. It's one of my favorites. I'm going to click and save it as a favorite so I can remember it. But I want to add this on top of the preset that I already have. So to do that, you're going to go over to your filter stack and click the plus button. And it's going to give you an empty layer, which gives you now the ability to add another preset. Then go over to the left-hand side and control click or right click on that preset, and it will give you this drop-down menu. And you have two options up at the top. You have Use Preset, which will replace the entire filter stack, or Insert Preset, and that's what we're looking for. So we're going to click on Insert, and you'll see down below it saved all of those nicely toasted layers, and then on top it added the layers for Nero. So we've pretty much doubled the filter stack here, but we got this super cool, really unique look. Now, what's even better about these filter presets, and one of the reasons why I think presets are the best way to work, is it's completely changeable. There are lots of different filters in here, and you'll see two of them are textures. We've got two texturizer layers in here, and I can turn them on and off by clicking on the little eye icon on the left and the right. Now, I much prefer this image without the textures. Textures are kind of hit and miss for me, especially the light leak. I think it's really distracting. It pulls away from the center of the image, which is what I'm looking for, and the other texture is okay, but it's a little too strong for my taste. It's not exactly what I want. So I can go down and I'm going to click on this light leak layer here. It's going to hide all of the filters that are above it. They're not gone, they're just hidden. And I'm going to go up and we're going to click the minus button. We're going to delete it. Then with this specific texture, I'm just going to lower the layer opacity down to about 30 or 40. Now when I click on my top layer again, I have a new after image, and I've created this really cool customized filter, and all I had to do was use two prepackaged ones and play around with them until they make something that I like. Now, just like before, I'll save this as my own personal preset, and I can use this again if I want to. So we'll call it Save Preset. We'll call it Faded Film Look, and we'll place it in a new category. We'll call it Liz's Film Presets, and click OK. And we'll go ahead and click Create. And now I have this new customized preset that I just created. And I can use this again and again and again, just like any other presets that I make. Okay, so let's go ahead and trash this. And we're going to add back that sepia concrete texture look, and we're going to click Apply, and it's going to process and pop us back into Lightroom. And I want to open up another image because there are still a couple of things I want to talk you guys through inside Perfect Effects. Now that I'm back here in Effects, we're going to open up another image. And I went through and I talked to you guys a little bit about blending modes, but one of the things that we haven't really talked about are are masking techniques. And the masking techniques are some of the things that make this program as amazing as it actually is. And there are lots of different ways that we can mask. And I think sometimes people forget that. They think that there's one way to do it because we show you one way a lot. If you've ever watched a webinar with me, you've probably seen one of these two images. I use them pretty often, and part of the reason why I do so is because they're horizontal landscapes. They're very easy to show how to work with the masking bug, as well as how to show how to work with the how to work with the brush tool. However, there are lots of other situations that you're going to run into where those tools are not going to work as well as you want them to. So I want to show you a couple other photos in here so that we can talk about it. And I also want to show you some really cool things that you can do with your images outside of what I just walked you through. So let's go ahead and take this image over into Perfect Effects. All right, go ahead and click on Edit and jump over there. Now, along with the basic masking bug, there are two other masking bugs, the radial and the reflected gradient, that are really important to know how to use. We're going to use something that's really obvious at first so that I can show you guys what they actually do, and then I'll actually give you an actual application for either of those tools. So let's start out, and we're going to add a photo filter layer, something that's super obvious. This is the one I always like to show. It's deep red, and it's a great way to understand how masking works. So with the masking bug, up in the tool options bar, you have your type drop-down menu, and you'll see your 3 different types. I'm going to go ahead and click inside my image to add a masking bug, and it's going to pull whatever type I had selected. So we're starting out with the reflected gradient. Now, the way that the reflected gradient works is you're going to see that anywhere on the inside of these 2 straight lines is going to remain my original image. Anything on the outside will slowly fade into red. That fade is affected by the dotted lines. This is the feathering around the edge of this tool. And I can pull it in if I need to be very exact, or I can pull it out if I want to have a softer look. You can rotate this as well if you need to, as well as invert it. Up in the tool options bar on the right-hand side, if you click the invert button, you can change that the center of this tool is either painting in or painting out. Now, if I wanted to, let's say I wanted to add a red overlay on this strip. It's this tiny little town in Oregon called Alsea, and I want to make this cool little building bright red for some reason. Now I can do that, and I can leave the rest of my image completely alone. Because of the fade, it'll look a little bit softer than if I just go in and paint it in and out. Now that's completely dependent on the image that you're working on and so on, but you get the idea that you have that option. That will work the exact same with the radial bug. The radial bug gives you the ability to create an oval. So I can scoot this around. We can change the size. We can rotate it. So if you're working with an oval and you may need to rotate it, you can go in and do that. Now, one of the cool things about the radial masking bug is I'm going to make it kind of this like weird oval here. Now, there are 2 different ways that you can resize the radial bug. One of them is by using this little hand tool. So when I use the hand tool, it only affects that specific axis that we're working on. So it's only affecting the top and the bottom here. If I hold my mouse on the outside just a little bit, you're going to get this double arrow. When you click and use that tool, it sizes the entire thing up and down, both the top and bottom and left and right points. Now, what's awesome about this is you can actually create colored vignettes. So this is something that I think should happen more often. It's a great way to create a classic film style look. If you've ever shot anything on a Polaroid camera, sometimes what can happen is you get this really cool kind of purplish, it depends on the film that you're using, but you can get this really cool, almost purplish look on the outside of the image, and it creates this super rad purple vignette. And you can't do that with the actual vignette tool, but you can do it here by using the radial masking bug. So up in the tool options bar, I'm going to click that invert button. So now we get this edge right around that's bright red. I'm going to create a larger feathering amount, and we're going to size this down a little bit so it creates this really nice burned in section around the edge of my entire image. And then if I wanted to create that kind of film style look with the photo filter layer that we added earlier, all you're going to do is change the color. So clicking on that color swatch there, it opens up this select color dialog, and I can go through and let's choose kind of a bluish purple, maybe like that, a little less saturated, make it quite a bit darker, and go ahead and click OK. Now, once we've done that, we can go through and we can play around with the entire photo filter, how we want it to work with our image, things like adjusting the polarizer, which is a great great option when you're working with this kind of fake vignette styling where you're trying to create a colorized vignette. Using that polarizer is going to help keep a lot of the tones of your original image intact without completely flattening them, and it makes it look a little bit more realistic. It flows a bit better from the center to the outside. And then you can also adjust the mode here. And the mode is completely dependent on your photo. For this image, I would probably use what's called clean shadows, which is more of a flatter, darker overlay, especially when you're working with photos of skies. You want to try and use that clean shadows mode. This is very similar to the blending options that we've worked with before. Strong and subtle are just like overlay and soft light, and clean highlights and clean shadows are just like the multiply and screen blending modes. So that's kind of what they're there for. Now, one of the practical applications that you're going to use these in is with our lens blur tool. And the lens blur tool, if you use the older versions of Perfect Photo Suite, if you used the older versions of the Perfect Photo Suite, then you're going to recognize what the lens blur is. It's part of an old tool that we used to use called Focal Point, and it gives you the ability to add a selective blur layer. And what we did is we tried to create it so that it makes the image look as though it's closer to an authentic film blur versus something that you create on a computer. If we went in and added just a plain Gaussian blur, you would be able to tell that it's really fake, like super fake, like crazy fake. Whereas when you use the lens blur filter, we give you a lot of options to try and make it appear as though it's real lens blur. Now, the option that I use almost primarily when adding lens blur is the tilt shift option. And it's right up at the top. I save it as a favorite so that I know what it is. And when you choose it, it automatically places the reflected gradient on your image. So I don't have to worry about trying to figure out which masking bug I actually need. Now, if you need to change the masking bug, if the reflected gradient does not work for you, you need the regular gradient, just go up to your tool options bar and change whichever one you actually need. It's completely up to you and what's going to work best for your photo. Now, once we've got it kind of placed, we're going to move it around just a little bit here, and we're going to soften it out quite a bit. Shrink it down. Now, on the right-hand side in the filter options pane, we can make adjustments like the blur amount. So we can either make it a little bit softer, we can make it crazy strong. I like to keep mine pretty low when I'm working on images, especially like this, where I don't need a lot of a blur. I need a really, really soft haze over the foreground and the background. There are things like the ability to add a motion blur if you'd like to. So if you need to go in and add a linear or a radial motion blur, you can actually go in and do that, which is super fun. We're going to go ahead and turn that off. You can change the aperture of the bokeh in the background. You can even go in and add things like blooming and brightness and contrast in those blurred areas. So a lot of times you'll see a highlight bloom that happens when you take images that are out of city lights, or if you're taking images of something with like a starry background, those highlights just look nice and bright. And that blooming slider is a way to really punch that up and make those highlights look really bright. Now for an image like this, it's not going to do much, but it's a good option to have. Now, one of the other really cool things about using the masking bug is the ability to combine the masking bug with the brush tool. Now, we went in, and anytime I hover my mouse over my image, you're going to see the bug. And it's pretty obvious where it actually is on the image because there's blur and then there's no blur. However, there isn't a straight line that matches the bottom of the building where the bicycle is to the top of the building because it's slightly slanted. And this reflected gradient masking bug is not going to pinch in a certain direction. So we have to go in and mask things out by hand. So all you do is once you've placed your masking bug, select your masking brush tool, and you can go in by hand and paint in and out the sections that you want. So what I suggest when you're doing this kind of paint in and out is you want to go up to the tool options bar and lower the opacity as low as you possibly can. I'm going to drop it all the way down to about 5 or 6, because what I want to show you is what we're doing is we're painting in the blur. I want to paint a little bit of blur right along the top of the building. When I paint even with 6%, look at how much blur is actually happening. It's quite a bit. So by painting it in very slowly, we're making sure that we keep that soft gradient that we tried to create earlier. So we want to make sure that we want to have that soft feathering that we made, and we want to hang on to that. So keep that opacity down as low as you possibly can. This is also a really good opportunity to use our perfect brush. And we're just going to go in and click and paint right along that top area. And now we get a much better blur along the edge of the building. We can clean it up if we need to. Just a little tiny bit of cleanup there. And there we go. So we've created this kind of cool customized look by using both of the masking tools. And this is something that's going to happen pretty regularly. You're not going to have a perfect image like we see all the time. And that's one of the things that sometimes can be frustrating when you're watching a demo and people are like, look at how great this tool works on this perfect image. This photo isn't perfect. And it's not perfectly straight. It's not perfectly exposed. These are two different images that I actually had to combine together because the first image was too dark and the second image was too light. So I started out with something that didn't look so great out of the camera. So a lot of times you're going to be using these tools in combination with each other. And what's wonderful is you can actually do that. There are a lot of ways that you can use them and create a perfect mask. Now, one of the other things that's important to remember is when you save a preset, if you use a masking bug in that preset, it will save the ability to access that bug. So I can go in and adjust it later depending on the image that I'm working on. So anytime that you save, say we created a really cool film style look and it was super great and we created a really cool purple vignette. But we want to make sure that we can adjust the size of that vignette depending on the next image that we bring in. That radial masking bug will be saved with that preset so I can readjust it. Any changes that you make with the brush tool will not be saved. So that little sliver that we just painted in right at the top of the building, not going to be saved. That's going to be left alone. And I'm going to have to repaint that in depending on the image that I bring in or if I put the photo back. So masking bugs saves with a preset, masking brushes do not. All right, let's go ahead and click. We're going to jump over and click apply really quick. We're going to save this effect and jump back into Lightroom. And the last thing that I want to walk you through is, let's see, we're going to jump back in, is I want to talk to you a little bit about presets with portraits. We haven't really talked much about portraits, despite the fact that we were using a silhouette at the beginning. It's not the most conventional portrait that you're going to see around, so it's not exactly the best to talk about how presets work. This image is a little bit better to talk about portraits and presets. So we're going to jump over to Effects, and we'll go ahead and click Edit. Now, when you're working with portraits, one of the best places to start is retouching. And I think you've probably heard that a million times. And it's wonderful to be able to do all of your retouching in one place. However, a lot of times you're going to end up with an image where there are a couple of small things that you're going to need to change. A couple of blemishes that you want to remove that you took out, but the skin is not very soft, or you're going to have a photo where you've got a lot of shine on somebody's face that you didn't remove. And it's completely dependent on what your retouching workflow is. We have something called the Portrait Enhancer here inside Perfect Effects, and it's a way for you to apply a surface blur to skin and do just a small amount of skin softening and retouching here in Effects without either A, having to go into another program or access the rest of the suite if you have the entire photo suite. So it's underneath the Portrait Enhancer category here, and you can choose whichever one you like. They're all about the same, so it's totally up to you what you want to use. Now, the way that it works is by accessing a specific skin color of your choosing, and then it places a blur on that skin selection. This is almost exactly the same technology as we saw earlier in the blending options underneath that Apply To drop-down menu. When we chose a color and we applied it to just the sky, we are using the same tools here in the Portrait Enhancer. So you want to choose your Eyedropper tool and hover it over kind of a general part of the skin. Select it, and it's going to soften anything surrounding that color. The range allows you to be either more specific or less specific about how much of the image you want to blur. I push my range all the way up because what we're going to do is we've gone in and we've added smoothing, we've added blemish removal. We can add a little bit of shine reduction in there because it's kind of, she's got a little bit of shine on her face. But you'll see that it's softening quite a bit. We're going to zoom in just a little bit so you can actually see that a bit better. So it's softening quite a bit of my image. Things like her hair. It's softening things like the creases on her nose and her lips, her eyebrows. We don't want that at all. So this Portrait Enhancer works best by using the masking brushes to take out any of the areas that you don't like. So we want to paint out the softening on the spots like the hair and the areas around her face. Now, it takes quite a while to go in and paint out all of the stuff in an image that might possibly be softened. So what I suggest is you use that Invert button up in the tool options bar. Remove the softening from the entire image and then slowly paint it back in the areas that you want it to be. Most of the time when I'm working on portraits, I find that a little bit easier than doing it the other way around. I think it depends on the size of your portrait. So if you're working on things like beauty images and you have like someone's face really up close in the entire image, then the invert button is not going to work for you. But I have no idea whether this accidentally softened everything in the photo, and I don't want to have to deal with that. So that tends to work best for me. All right, so now we've gone in and we've added a little bit of skin softening to her face. I can lower the layer opacity down just a tad so it's not quite so strong. Just a bit of shine reduction and blemish removal there to kind of create more of a unified look for her skin. That's always the best place to start when you're working on portraits. Now, a couple of the other really great filters to note when you're working with portraits. One of them is the sunshine category. And we talk about this all the time, partially because it is so cool. It is so cool. The way that the sunshine filter works is by applying this kind of glowy contrast that makes all of the skin tones in the image really bright and really soft. It adds a little bit of warmth and saturation, and you can also manually add even more of a glow to the entire photo. It doesn't soften the image in the sense that it's removing detail, but it does create that kind of glowy look on a lot of the highlights and the shadows, which is really, really nice. It's controlled by an amount slider. This is how much sunshine you want to add to your image. This is with 0, and as I slowly move it over, it just increases the contrast and makes everything look really bright and really nice. I like to manually add just a tiny bit of warmth too. Be careful not to go overboard because you can make the entire image look orange. So I usually scoot this over probably like 2 or 3, and that's just enough to warm the entire image up. There's a saturation slider if you need to saturate your image more or less. I like to add just a tiny bit of saturation in there. And then last, there's the glow slider. And when you're working on portraits, especially outdoor portraits, adding a soft glow can really make the entire image look like it was shot on a beautiful, bright, sunny day. Even when, if you live somewhere like Oregon where it rains every single, oh my gosh, day of the entire year, and we're stuck with clouds all the time, we have to fake it. We have to fake it a lot. And it really stinks. So I use this sunshine filter probably on I think I use it on 90% of my images now because it's not sunny here. It rains all the time. We just went through snowpocalypse and we had tons of snow and everything was closed, and that's pretty typical for us. So when I'm shooting pictures outside, especially during the wintertime, using this filter is a way to kind of brighten up the entire image and make it appear as though it was a little bit softer, it was a little bit brighter, it was a little bit warmer outside. And I use this on portraits and I use it on landscapes. It's great for tons of different images. And it works inside or outside. So don't just think that you have to use it on outdoor images. I use this on studio shots as well, just to make the entire image look as though it's a little bit warmer and a little bit brighter. Now, one of the last ones that I want to show you when it comes to portraits, and it's something that I think is useful that a lot of people forget about, is the color enhancer. Now, it seems a little strange to bring up the color enhancer because I think sometimes what happens is people kind of forget that they need to edit colors. Not in the sense that, they're not color correcting their images, but these photos are separated down into separate channels and everything has been pulled apart so that we can individually choose which part of our photo we're working on. And when you're working on portraits, primarily you're working with people who have skin tones that have a little bit of a yellow and a little bit of a red undertone. And so by adjusting those colors, you can change not only the base of the skin color, but you can remove things like red or magenta undertones that maybe you don't necessarily want to be there. Now, you can choose whichever option you really want here. It doesn't really matter which one you're going to choose. I'm going to start out and just go up to the top and choose auto color. It's going to try and auto correct the color for me. Up at the top of the color enhancer, just turn that auto button off so you don't have to worry about it. Then scroll down to the color range drop-down menu here and open up either the red, orange, or yellow. Sometimes the magenta, depending on the person. I'm going to open up the red, and I'm going to push the saturation slider all the way over to the right. Anything that has that reddish, high saturation look is affected by the red channel. Once I know what parts of my image are going to be affected, I can adjust accordingly. So I can desaturate just a little bit, so her skin isn't quite so pink. I can adjust the color. If I want her skin to be a little bit more orange and a little less pink, if I move that over to the right a little bit, it's going to help remove that magenta look. And then I can also adjust the brightness. If I want to darken it just a tad, you'll see her cheeks get a little bit darker and her lips get a little bit darker, giving her more of a contrast in her face. And I can use this exact same technique on all of the different parts of this image. The yellows work really well for affecting things like blonde hair. You'll see the yellow is kind of brightening up on her hair. And the orange also works really well for affecting hair. So as we move it to the right, it's going to affect pretty much all of her hair and a large portion of her face. So if we want to make her hair nice and bright, make it appear as though it's been dyed recently, or adjust the color of it, we can actually scoot the hue slider over to the left and give her the appearance as though she's more of a strawberry blonde than a classic bottle blonde. So a lot of these things are options that people, I think about, but don't necessarily access or don't ever bother trying out on their own images. And it's one of the coolest ways to work is you're sectioning your image down into all of these little parts and adjusting each one individually to practically create a completely different image. Where we started and where we ended up with this photo is very different. Very, very different. And we've changed the way that she looks and we've changed the way the entire image looks. So it's one of those cool things about effects and about using filters that can be so much fun is that selective editing process.